That's what this course is all about. Nassim and I have spent our lifetimes working through the language of science, a relatively neutral language of science, to understand to the best of our ability what the new stories are that are emerging, the stories that change the way we think, that empower us to solve our problems and to think differently and to share what we understand now with our families and our friends. And that's what we are doing through these modules. So this is beyond an academic conversation. So let's begin at the very beginning. Let's begin where our story begins, and it begins long before we ever emerge into this world. It begins with our cosmology. Many people think that cosmology is out there, it's all about space, but we are the product of whatever is happening in our cosmology, and our cosmology has changed over time. Almost universally, ancient texts and traditions, they tell us a story. What they tell us is that we are deeply connected to everything in the universe. We're connected to one another, we're connected to ourselves, we're connected to the cosmos, to all forms of life. They tell us that we are the product of intelligent processes that have emerged over long periods of time. I've been blessed in my adult life. For almost 40 years of my adult life, I've had the opportunity to travel and to explore some of the most isolated, remote, beautiful, pristine, magnificent places remaining in the world today, from the monasteries and the nunneries and the high plateaus of central China and Tibet, across Nepal and India, through the Bedouin traditions of North Africa, all through the Andean traditions of South America, and the Yucatan with the shamans and the healers and the curanderos, and all through the American desert Southwest and the Aboriginals in Australia and other places. And I say this because, as different as those traditions are from one another, they all share a very similar story. And that story is that we are the product of a living essence, an intelligent essence, that we are deeply connected, not only with ourselves, but with one another and with the earth around us and beyond the earth into the cosmos. For most of human history, that has been our story. But with the birth of modern science, all that changed. So we say that science began about 300 years ago, during the time of Isaac Newton, when he formalized the laws of physics. And it was with the birth of science that the term that you've all heard, where we throw the baby out with the bathwater. What that means is that when one part of an idea no longer works, you throw the whole idea out, even though parts of the idea may still be valid. Science did that when it comes to our story, when it comes to who we are in our relationship to the world. Science teaches us today, and you and I are the product, if you've been in a public school in the West in the last 150 years, if your children are in school today, unless they're very, very blessed to be in a very, very progressive system, where they are actually honoring the new discoveries. You and I have been taught the story that we're the product of a dead universe, that the universe is dead and inert, and the product of what is called lucky physics, where the conditions just happen to occur in just the right way at just the right time for the universe to form as it has formed. Now, there's a consequence to that thinking. Because if you honestly believe, consciously and subconsciously in your mind and your heart, that the universe is just a product of lucky physics, if you believe that the universe is dead and everything is separate from everything else, that gives the powers that be the reason to think in terms of the earth being ours to exploit, to dominate, to harness the powers and the forces, because there's no reason to think otherwise. The universe is an accident. It's dead. It's separate. It's inert. That thinking is reflected throughout our culture and our society and our history. It's reflected as a lack of respect for the natural world, for example. I remember when I was growing up in the Midwest of the United States in the 1950s, 1960s, and the interstate highway system had just been built. They were building this after the Second World War, originally to transport military across our country never thinking that civilians would take to the highways the way that we have, and an entire industry developed along those highways, including fast food. So I remember 50s and 60s, people stopping at fast food restaurants, and when they were finished with the meals that they got in the paper cups and the paper bags and the plastic containers, they wanted to throw them away. And at that time, away simply meant out of sight. So those containers went right out the window because there was no reason not to litter. And the medians of the interstates in many cities were cluttered with paper and bags and wrappers and cups and straws for miles and miles and miles, until we developed an awareness that when you throw something away, away does not mean just out of sight. It was a way of thinking back then, because the idea was that Earth is so vast, the oceans are so big, and there's so much land in the US that we can just dispose of things by getting them out of our sight. Well, you and I know that's all changing now, fortunately. There's a new awareness that is developing, but the thinking underlying that kind of disposal is a direct consequence of us being taught that there's nothing really special about the cosmos, nothing really special about our relationship to the cosmos. So the question is, we're running out of resources now on the planet. We're starting to look at other places. We're looking at planets to mine, the moon, for example, and the planet Mars and asteroids. Here's the question, are we going to exploit those places the way that we've exploited our own planet because of the thinking that we have been led to embrace, that everything is separate and that we are living in a dead and inert universe?